All right. So, good evening, everyone. We're going to do another short drush now on Parshat Toldot. It's a nice one. It's about what happens at the end of this week's Parsha after the brachot, after Yaakov and Esav kind of have a little bit of Esav gets upset that Yaakov steals the brachot from him, and gets very upset. And then what happens is that Rivka tells Yaakov to run away to Lavan's house, and she says it in a unique way, and she says one thing to Yitzchak and one thing to Yaakov, and that's really where this is where the Zera Shimshon is coming in. He's told to flee to Haran, right, to go to because out of fear that Esav is going to kill him, and he hides out there for 14 years. Studying Torah, and we know, as the Midrash says, that he's going to learn Torah in the yeshiva of Ever. But one of the things that we see is that he was unable to do is to be mechabed his parents, meaning he's able to honor his parents, which we know, and the Gemara mentions it. The Gemara mentions in the Megillah. He mentions that the Gemara in Megillah mentions the fact that Yaakov gets punished for this. So now we're going to say Megillah Sof, it's Drush Tet Zayin, which is Drush number 16 on this week's Parsha. It's the last one. It says Megillah Sof Parakam, and at the end of the first chapter of Megillah, Daf Tet Zayin as well. It says it actually appears in the Ein Yaakov, but which is like the kind of like the shorter version of the Gemara, if you will. It says Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Marta Mishmei Derav. Gadol Talmud Torah Yoter Mikubud Aveim Shekol Yudal Shanim Shaya Yaakov Beit Ever Lo Na'anash Aleim Ad Kan Lashano. So the Zera Shimshon brings a small piece of the first from Daf Tet Zayin in the Gemara. It says that Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Mata says in the name of Rav that all 14 years that Yaakov Avinu was learning in the yeshiva of Ever. He was not punished for them, even though during that time he was not able to be mechabed his parents. Ad kan l'shalom, that's what he said. So basically, when Yaakov was forced to flee to Haran, he did not go there directly, but he spent 14 years learning at Ever. That's also next week's parsha. It's mentioned there several times. Anyway, but he was separated from his son Yosef for 22 years as a punishment for the 22 years that he spent away in Haran, away from his parents. He was not punished for the prior 14 that he had spent studying Torah. Right. So we have 14 years where he was learning, and then he got punished for 22 years because that was the total amount. He was separated for 20 years. As punished for the 22 years he spent in Haran away from his parents. But he was not...
That doesn't make sense. Why would he... You're saying retroactive is punished for the 14 as well.
Well, so that's what... Right, so the question is... So he's going to answer the question you're about to ask. What your question is really good, actually. He's going to answer the question. The Zera Shimshon is going to answer it. He mentions, or he implies, at least he doesn't really say exactly, but he implies the fact that perhaps he gets punished only for the 8, not for the 14. You understand? So there's the 14 he may not have gotten when it wasn't. He's going to get to the point, but he's going to say is that the 14 maybe he could have you could have sort of say that maybe he's going to get to the point, but that Torah maybe is a valid enough reason to not have to be mechabed the parents, but the other extra 8 years, that's where maybe he's going to say that, or imply it at least. V'iksham marsha. Why was Yaakov punished even for those 22 years? Right? So he says, Maharsha asks the question. He says, maybe why does Yaakov get punished for 22 years? Didn't his parents tell him go? Didn't his parents say go? Right, presumably, right. By saying if someone tells their child to go, they understand what it implies, and it implies that maybe they wanted him to go, and they're willing to forego their kavod of kibbud avim. There are many explanations for this. In Yaakov, Rabbi Chaim, etc. Many other explanations to it, but he's going to give Zera Shimshon is going to offer his own explanation. He says, in our opinion, this question does not even start. Sharei Yaakov lo yashav etzel Lavan ela mechmat hayira sh'ayta lo imo misav. Right? We know what was the original reason for why Yaakov went to Lavan? It was because he had fear for his life. There's no. It's very clear in the psukim that's the reason. Aval aviv lo tzivalo ela lechet sham v'likach lo misham isha. Kadesh lo yikach mi b'not Canaan. But if we look in the psukim, and this is what the Zera Shimshon is picking up on, and this is what, like, it's so obvious in the psukim, but we never really pick up on it. But he says is that if the way the psukim read is that Yaakov was commanded by Yitzchak, go marry a woman from the area of Lavan, of Lavan's area of Canaan, right? You should not take a wife. You should not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan, right? But rather you should go down to Haran, find yourself a wife, right? That's what Rivka tells Yitzchak. Right, so he says, right? What would Yitzchak assume? What would most people assume when they tell their parents, when the parents tell the son, go off, find yourself a wife? Means go out there, do what you got to do, find yourself a wife, bring her home, just like I did, right? Like, Yitzchak is thinking, how long is it going to take? Right. Take a year, 2 years, whatever. But it wasn't. It was certainly not saying 22 years. That was definitely clear. Right? Even though Rivka tells Yaakov, remain there a short time with your brother, until your brother, till Esav calms down a little bit. But what happens? Which would include, meaning, even though Rivka said a short time until your brother's anger calms down, you could easily say, wait a little bit, calm things down, and then you can come back. So maybe you could say that her her statement to Yaakov could be okay with the 22 years. But we still have a question as to what was said to Yitzchak. And this is what he said. And this is what he says here. Halok shadibra Rivka Yitzchak al Yichat Yaakov, right? Lo amra lo ella katzti b'chaya mipnei b'chet. Right? What did Rivka say to Yitzchak? Rivka says to Yitzchak that I will be disgusted with my life. And Katsi b'chayim means I really will be disgusted on the life if the daughters of Chet, if Yaakov marries one of the daughters of Chet, like these people here. But she didn't say, really what I do is, yes, I want him to go get married over there. But second reason is really I want him to get away from here because I don't want him to get killed. Meaning that's not the reason, right? It seems to imply that Rivka understood what the tension was happening between Yaakov and Esav, and it seems also that Yitzchak either was not aware or didn't really think it was that bad or whatever it was, but there's some sort of dynamic here that's not clear between the three of them, between that is Yaakov, Yitzchak, and Rivka understood something that Yitzchak didn't. So either way, he says, Im Kain, Yaakov lo hayala reshut me'aviv litakev sham. Right? Accordingly, at the very least, we see that Yaakov did not have permission from Yitzchak to stay for 22 years. And even though he had a commandment from his mother to stay, that would not help him. Right? But either way, they still have, both of them, that is Yaakov and Rivka, have some sort of obligation towards Yitzchak. So either way, even though Rivka says, "Don't worry, it's okay, stay as long as you need," wait till your brother's anger calms down a little bit. Yitzchak said, "Go to find yourself a wife and come back." So we still have a problem here, right? We still have a problem is where Yitzchak is telling him, "Go take care of business, go find yourself a wife and come back," and Rivka is saying, "Stay as long as you need." To calm the anger, and there's this question here in the middle, which he doesn't really answer, is why did Rivka, or he kind of answers it, why did Rivka not say everything to Yitzchak? But the way I understand it, at least, is that Rivka didn't want the anger, the issue of the tension between Yaakov and Esav to come up in Yitzchak. Yitzchak was already old and frail, so she didn't want to make that a bigger deal. But either way, so he says, "Af lashona braita diita hata daikanami." So daikahachi, the language of the braita here that is in the Gemara says the Tani. It says Yosef parash me'aviv kafet shana. Yosef was separated from his father for 22 years. Kishem she Yaakov parash me'aviv kafet shana. Just as Yaakov had been separated from his father for 22 years. Dinakat aviv davka. The braita there mentions specifically his father. Right? Because his mother, what did Rivka say? Rivka said, "It's okay, stay as long as you need because your brother's anger is going to come." But the Braita says, that he was away from his father, not from his parents. He should have said from his parents, right? But he says here from his father. So now he says, proposes, Zera Shimshon now is going to give another reason as to why Yaakov was punished. It's not enough. We have to say that not only did Yaakov fail to fulfill the mitzvah of kibbud avim, but rather he really was being mizalzel in his cover by not being there. Meaning, by remaining in Haran for so long, not only was he being disrespecting him, it was being rude, like it was being the opposite, right? Not only was he not being mechabed, which is one thing, he's being mizalzel by saying, I'm just going to stay as long as you want, I need to stay, right? In other words, he doesn't really, if you look at the psukim in next week's parsha, he doesn't really mention that often, does he mention his father saying, oh, I miss my father, or I miss my parents, like, it doesn't happen. So he's saying is that what the Zera Shimshon is saying, I don't understand, how is this possible that Yaakov Avinu, the greatest of the great is not only not being mechabed, but he's actually being, and he uses the word mizelzel, which is a pretty strong word, right? So he says, he says, Garti. What happens in 2 weeks part in Vayishlach in 2 weeks part in two parshiot? It says what happens. We know that Yaakov, when he finally does meet Esav, what did he say? In Lavan Garti, right? I lived with Lavan. And I sojourned, meaning I was like a garti. I wasn't living permanently. Lo na'aseti tzar v'chashuv. I did not become some sort of important person there. Elager, I was rather a foreigner. Eincha kedai lisnoti al brachot. Therefore, he says because you should not. He says to Esav, you should. This is Rashi, not the Zera Shimshon is quoting Rashi. He says is you should not think that the brachot came on me. Right, because you might be angry. If you were angry that the brachot came true, you shouldn't. Because look, I lived with Lavan for 22 years. I lived like a simple person. I was a foreigner. I wasn't some great person. I didn't get all the kavod and whatever it is. And he says, Lonit kamabi, the brachot of that you will be like a great person above your brother never came true. Hiksha siftei chacham. The siftei chachamim asked the question, Shezeu kamo zilzul b'chvod aviv, that this seems to be a degrade, like a zilzul of his father. Lomar shabrachot shelo shaya adam gadol lo yitkamu. Right? It's a great question about the siftei chachamim. He says, is how is it possible that Yaakov Avinu would say that about his father? How would he say it was about his father? Saying is, don't worry, Esav, I never became a great person. Which basically saying is that my dad's bracha never came true. Right? And he's saying is that the bracha that my father gave, it wasn't really a meaningful.
Different ways to answer that. It eventually will come true.
Yeah,
he's trying to say his life is.
Right. So he's going to get to that point as well. And you're right. It's definitely an answer. There's definitely a way to answer it very simply. So like you said, he's trying to belittle the brachot so that his anger is calmed, and he calms his anger a little bit. But even so, it's a good question. Meaning he's saying is like the way the tone of voice definitely comes across as saying is, listen, he meant to say that you're going to be a great person. It didn't happen 22 years later. It still hasn't happened yet. You can't be so angry. Right now, you and me could say, listen, 22 years, the guy lived till, he's 100 and something, so he's got some more time for it to happen, or maybe it's not going to happen yet, or whatever it is. But maybe that's the point. The point is that it implies some sort of zilzul. Like even when we say things, sometimes we say things and it implies something that we didn't mean. Right. But it definitely, someone else can interpret it as that. So that's what I think he's saying here, is that it implies some sort of, the Siftei Chachamim says, at least implies, says he thinks that it implies that there's some sort of, lowering of the kavod or the greatness of Yitzchak Avinu. So now he says, Af anu nomar, so we should, so too, he says, Shekol od sheYaakov nitakeh bebeit Lavan kedei she'esav lo yargenu, zeu zilzul b'brachot shel aviv. He says that as long as Yaakov was living in Lavan's house, so that Esav would not kill him, right? So he says this is belittling his father's brachot. What's the simplest question? Like if the brachot were meant to be happen, then what should have happened? Yaakov should have just stayed where he was. Like he didn't have to get thrown out. Like he didn't have to get chased out even by his mother. Like if the brachot were really going to happen to be mitkayem on Yaakov, look what he says. It would be impossible for Esav to kill him. Meaning, if the brachot were really meant to happen and take place, and to kind of take that Yitzchak's bracha would take place on Yaakov, so then Esav would literally be impossible for Esav to kill him.
Really?
That's what he says. Right? What should have happened? Right? He should have done is he should have come back. He finds his wife, comes back, and there should be no more fear. Like Yitzchak told him, go find a wife. Goes find a wife, comes back, and then Esav's anger maybe would have been first of all, just to find the wife and come back, it would have been at least a little bit of time. So maybe Esav would still be angry, but at the same time, if Yaakov's brachot were really meant to happen, then Esav would be literally prevented by whatever reason. It would be impossible for him to kill him. So he says, this is the reason. He says, this may also be the reason, which I think is really interesting. He says, this is the reason why Rivka doesn't tell Yitzchak, this is why Yitzchak, that Rivka never tells Yitzchak the real reason, her real reason for sending Yaakov away is because she realizes how bad it is. Meaning, at the time, it's like what I said, like you said, as I said before, plausible deniability. Meaning, she says, I don't want him to get a wife here. So she says, okay, send him for a wife. But if that was the case, and Esav was really, if the brachot of Yitzchak were really supposed to fall on Yaakov, so then he should have just gone to get a wife and come back. But Rivka understood that it's not just a wife. There's another reason there. In other words, she said one thing, but she meant two things. And the second thing is really save your life, right? So that's why she didn't say that. And that she didn't want to. Rivka realized that if she would have said that Esau was going to kill Yaakov, then it would have been mizalzel the kavod of her husband, that is Yitzchak. She said, I would be disgusting with my life. Meaning, she was being very sensitive to what the situation was. She realized that creating more strife between Esav and Yaakov would never help Yitzchak. So she said, I don't want my son getting married to someone from here. Send him to my brother's house. And there's another, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh mentions why you send him over there if we know that it's not a good place over there. Lavan was not exactly a tzaddik, and we know that already, like we realized from beforehand. But either way, she chose. What happens here is that Rivka really chose only that Yaakov should go to find a wife and protect himself from Esav, and not to protect himself. Oh, sorry, I'm reading it here. She chose to say only that Yaakov should go find a wife, and not the other part about being protected from Esav, as that would have been kind of been like a lowering of Yitzchak's kavod in some way. Or the brachot also, meaning the brachot that he just gave, it would be a degrading of it if she says, I think that Esav is going to kill him, and therefore the brachot that you just said were basically almost like thrown away. Right? So he says, why was Yaakov punished for 22 years? It was not because he was unable to honor his parents, right? They gave him permission to go. However, by remaining there out of fear of Esav, he was projecting a lack of confidence that Yitzchak's blessing, that Yitzchak's brachot would protect him. This was considered a zilzul of his honor. Right? So in other words, what he's saying is that it's a very sensitive thing, and that's one of the reasons why I picked this one is I happen to find that when we say things, we think that we're saying it correctly, and maybe one of the words, our intonation or whatever it is, we think it's fine, and then when someone says, "What do you mean? That's like the worst thing to say," and then you're like, "That's not what I meant." You're like, well, that it's back and forth. That she, or maybe you're not saying everything, right? You're not giving me the whole picture. And if you tell me sometimes when you talk to a person, they say everything's great, but what they're really saying is it's not great, but I don't really want to start going into it, right? So the same thing here. Rivka says, I don't want him to marry a girl from here. I want him to go there. I didn't tell you that your two sons are about to kill each other, right? I didn't say that. So because she didn't want to, out of respect for her husband, she didn't want to kind of degrade his level of bracha, and she also didn't want to create more strife in the argument. And now he says, which again is another continued, builds on the next part of it. A good question. You still have a question as why was Yaakov punished, right? The ein zilzul klal dichvodo shel Yitzchak. Right? He says it's not in any way would it be belittling Yitzchak's honor, as we learn to stay in Haran. Why? As we learn we learn a basic principle in Psachim, Heicha d'shchiach hezeka and somchim alanes. Right? Like you said, good question. Right? He says if we know that there's going to be right. If I know that if I jump off the building, I'm not waiting for the parachute. Right? Like I can't say, oh God, send me the parachute or send me the mattress. Right? I know what's going to happen. Right? So it's the same thing here. Yaakov lo yara'u le'anesh klal. Yaakov should not be deserving of any punishment. Sharei muchrach masav hayali brach. Right? He was forced. It was clear that he had to run away. Right? At least from Yaakov and Rivka's perspective, it was clear that he should run away. Mipnei sakanat nafsho shel ergo Esav, right? So that Esav would not kill him. So to stay with his parents and rely on Yaakov's bracha, like your question, your implied question was, how can you rely on Yitzchak's bracha to stay there? It was clear that Esav wanted to kill him. He had no choice. How can we think that he should be punished for 14 years of learning Torah? Right now, what's going on here? Since it was not permissible since it was permissible, since he had to run away because he was out of fear of life, right? Why does the Gemara even say that he should be punished for 14 years, for those 14 years? How can we, also more so than that, is that we say that the Gemara says from here that the Torah study is greater than Kibbud Avim. How can we learn it from here if it's not a good example, if he was running away from, for his fear of his life? That's not a good way. That's not a good case to say this is why Torah is greater than Kibbud Avim, right? So he says, so if we look, especially this is especially difficult based on the fact that what the Maharsha says is that after 14 years, I don't know where the Maharsha gets it from, I'm sure he proves it, he says that after 14 years, right, Esav was already calm. So now we have a question, what's the calm? We have a question of the 8 years that really are right? So he says here, accordingly, he was not punished for the 14 years because it was not necessary to be in hiding, and he was punished for the later years because by then, it paused. So therefore, we have no proof that Torah study is greater than honoring parents. Meaning, what he's saying is that for 14 years we can say, okay, maybe for those 14 years we can understand that either his Torah was protecting him, or maybe he had a good valid reason. He had to run away. He had nothing else to do. So he doesn't say it here, and he's going to get to another. He's going to prove why why learning Torah is greater than Kibbud Avim in a second. But I think what happens here, and similar, he says mentions it several times throughout his farm. The Zera Shimshon is implying is what was the original intent? Meaning, what was the person doing from the beginning? He was running away. Maybe he was running away from At first, he was running away from his life, but he says if your original intent was really to go find a wife and to kind of do the next thing, which is to be mechabed your parents, so then the original intent you get, even though the first 14 years you kind of did the right thing, the next 8 years were also meaning that the next 8 years were also the right thing. Meaning that what happens, he's saying, is that what even though I think we said a couple of weeks ago, I don't remember which parsha it was, we said that with Lot, with Sodom. Sodom's intention from the beginning, even though Sodom, they didn't really do something that wrong at the beginning, towards the end, the entire, you kind of see that everything that they did up until then was just basically a combination, or everything from the moment they started till that moment, where basically it shows it kind of shows a pattern. So here too, Yaakov shows a pattern of that. His pattern was to be in some way to learn Torah, to be mechabed his parents, and to be to save his life. So it was, so the 14 years we can account for. The other 8 years, he in some way, I believe that Zera Shimshon is saying is, even though the 8 years he's going to get punished for, he will get punished for, but he only get paid for the extra part of it because he probably should have realized that after the 14 years, after that moment of things were calming down. Although the question is, how does he know that things were calmed down? So that's a question. And also, he should have, there's always this classic question, I also asked many more times later with Yosef, is there's no way that he could go back. Why didn't he just go back once and say, hey, Dad, I'm alive? And then go back and say, I got to take care of my kids. It's not that, how far could it have been, right? Kvitza derech or whatever, he could have gone back for a couple of days, said, I'm okay, and then go say, listen, I got married, my kids are there, my wife is there. Why does he have to start building a whole life without coming back? Don't have that. Anyways, so he says, V'yesh lomar, Damrina b'yoma v'hevio nami Maharsha Sham b'samuch. We said in Gemara and Yoma, and the Maharsha brings it here as well in this Gemara from Megillah. Yitzchak Avinu zaken v'yoshev b'yeshiva haya. Yitzchak Avinu, this is a fascinating piece of Gemara. He says that the Maharsha mentions it, but the Gemara also mentions it in Megillah. He says that Yitzchak Avinu had his own yeshiva. When I learned this the other day, I never knew that. So he says here, Shayalo Beit Midrash Kamo Shayala Ever. Ever and Yitzchak Avinu had a Beit Midrash, similar ones. When Pnei Pachad Esav, had he been, because of fear of Esav, Yaakov was run away. He could have just said, listen, I'm scared. I'll just go into my dad's, go into my father's Beit Midrash, And Esav, even though he might want to kill me, he's not going to go in there and do it. Right? It's my father's Beit Midrash. He still has some sort of level of Kibud Av, whatever it is. V'adai Esav lo yimitenu sham. Right? Of course, he's not going to get killed there. Just as he did, find himself and hid himself in the Beit Midrash of Aver. Therefore, he would have also done, by staying in Yitzchak Avinu's Beit Midrash, he would have gained two things. A, saving his life. B, he would have been able to be mechaber his father, right? Because he's staying in the yeshiva. This is why we think that he deserves punishment. While it's true that he needed to run away, he could have done so in a manner that he would still be able to honor his parents. He deserved to be punished for not being there. The reason why he was not punished must be right? Because we have to think about it the other way. He says think about it. If his whole goal is to protect himself from Esav, and he stays in the yeshiva of Yitzchak, what happens? He can only do one thing: learn Torah. He can't be mechabed his parents because he can't go out and say, "Hey, mom, dad, you want some food? Hey, mom, dad, you want some water?" Because as soon as he leaves the Beit Midrash, Esav is waiting for him. He's got him in his crosshair, so he's got to run away. He's got to do something else. Sharei Talmud Torah. So therefore, we see at the end not having able to fulfill the mitzvah of Kibud Av. Sharei Talmud Torah Gadol Mikibud Av. We see that the Torah learning is greater than. I think they'll be down. I think they say 9:45, right? Yeah, okay, it's fine. So B'ezrat Hashem. So he says, therefore we say he would not have no right to interrupt his learning to fulfill the mitzvah of Kibud Av. So therefore, his staying in his father's Beit Midrash, that is in Yitzchak's Beit Midrash, would not have helped him because he would not be able to fill the Kibud Av. Therefore,
why not?
Because if he stays in the Beit Midrash of Yitzchak, he can't leave, and therefore, anytime his parents say, "Hey, we need some help," or we want to go, he wants to serve them food, he can't leave, because as soon as he leaves, Esav is on the prowl. So he can't do that. So what we learn from this whole thing is clear that we learn from this that Kibud Av, this whole thing, what was the whole point of the Zera Shimshon trying to prove? He's saying that Kibud Av, that learning Torah is greater than Kibud Av. Now, even though people who, and today for sure, everyone, we say, anyone who's a Baal Tshuva, anyone who's learning, so always says, make sure you keep a relationship with your parents. Don't ignore them. Don't excommunicate them. But what we learn from here is, he says, and Yaakov could have presumed, right? He says, what he says at the end of the day is, why was Yaakov punished? He was probably punished, most likely, for, even though Torah study is greater than Kibud Av, there was some sort of gap in between the 14 years that he learned and then the 8 years that was like the extra 8 years. And I think even though he was punished for 22, which you would say, well, why would he punish for the whole thing? I think we have to say is that even though his learning was important and it was valuable and everything, we have to say that perhaps those extra 8 years, he got punished as if it was 22, the full 22, because his learning was important and valuable, but that extra time he could have, after those 14 years, even if we say he didn't know that Esau was common or whatever, even if we say that, we could have said, okay, after 14 years, we could have said, okay, it's time for him to come back. And he didn't. And therefore he stayed extra, and that extra time is what he gets punished for, even though, and to kind of bring it all back, and he gets kind of punished for Yosef as well. Yosef, and therefore with Yosef, Yaakov gets punished the same kind of, like, that was the whole thing, was because he didn't respect his parents for 22 years, that is Yaakov to Yitzchak, so therefore Yosef had the same 22 years as well. That was the whole point of this whole Torah, is that he's saying, how is this possible? And he says, because he did something, he was not being mechabed his parents, or at least one of his parents, and therefore, so too here, we see that Yosef also kind of got the similar kind of situation happened with Yosef. Anyway, so, maybe, amen.